exciting thing for me today is that I get to spend time with some of my favorite persons in the industry. We have, to begin with, a very esteemed panel, high caliber professionals, men and women of consequence. Who work in different areas. Some are in government, some lead in industry, private sector, some are transforming the decentralized finance world as we speak. And of course, their backgrounds are much more extensive and colorful than my personality. So without further ado, I want to begin this session on trends and challenges of crypto compliance in 2022 and 2023. Now, I thought what I'd be talking about would be recent, last week, when I planned my questions. And then I was up last night, I was just scrolling through my LinkedIn page and I saw one of our panelists had posted, shared some news about the latest sanctions on the Iran Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. So, we're always catching up. And so I'm very excited to talk about sanctions today, as we do have a lot of development in the field, especially cyber-related sanctions. Now, one of the most contentious things that has happened is that we've not only sanctioned, or OFAC has not only sanctioned individuals and entities, but lately we have been sanctioning smart contracts. And some authorities in the world have indicted developers of smart contracts. So I want to go to a very esteemed panelist, Dante Disparte, first. He is the Chief Strategy Officer, the head of global policy at Circle. Previously, he was an appointee at the FEMA National Advisory Group and has also co-authored a book, a very popular book, Global Risk Agility and Decision Making, as risk is what he likes to nerd out on, and also was a vice chair of Libra Association, Libra with Facebook, and the founding advisor now of Global Blockchain Business Council. So Dante, if I may, I think you've thought a great deal as the head of strategy at Circle. You've probably thought a great deal about smart contracts and really the ramifications of enforcement activity on people who develop smart contracts. What does the detention of Alexei Patsev, the Tornado Cash developer, by Dutch authorities, what does it mean for the industry? And now, do you think does this set a precedence for the enforcement of writing code? And really, just what are your thoughts? Please tell us how to think about this.
Yeah, well, first of all, Jinisha, Suzanne, and of course, all colleagues from TCAE, thank you for having me share some time with you. Hopefully the next time around, this is an in-person conversation, because you've not only assembled a few of my favorite colleagues and subject matter experts on the topic, I'm sure this would be a very vigorous discussion. So on the one hand, crypto learns all too often what these government agencies are and what these instruments are in the context of reactions on crypto Twitter. I think the discussion around compliance, financial inclusion, financial innovation, and financial integrity has to be much more nuanced. And herein, on the one hand, people overreacted on the concept that the US government used a blunt force instrument to ban technology, and that technology and code should be protected by free speech. However, if good code gets co-opted by bad actors and successfully helps launder $7 billion, of which a large proportion went to rogue nuclear North Korea, it is hard for anybody to make a plausible and credible defense that financial crime compliance obligations should not also apply. And so what I would have rather have seen from the crypto community, and I suspect a lot of the people paying attention to today's discussion are hopefully in agreement with this posture, is rather than litigate on crypto Twitter and literally now litigate against the US government and the Treasury Department, the posture should have been, how can we leverage the superpowers of crypto, which is this idea of collective defense and collective witness, to make it impossible or difficult for bad actors to co-opt the financial system that then has the insidious effect of locking people out who should otherwise enjoy financial access as a human right. And so ironically, of course, the facts and circumstances of the case, the potential linkages of the developer to Russian intelligence interests and whatever reporting is coming out should not be the basis of litigating matters that clearly not a lot of people have all of the details on, and that the overreaction in hindsight may have given an industry that has a complex brand to defend an even more complex posture, when at this time we actually have quite a lot of very constructive engagement with the government, constructive engagement with policymakers and regulators in Washington. And candidly, the financial integrity bodies around the world have been the very first to acknowledge what digital assets could represent, and have been the very first to try to leverage the superpowers of blockchain, again, back to that point of making it hard for bad actors to co-opt an entire financial system. So we should watch this space. The last thing I would just say, just again, to the point about trying to bring this to the most recent information, is that OFAC has recently issued some guidance around how good actors could extricate their funds with license, where again, the technology itself may have been co-opted by bad actors. So it's a super nuanced, complex issue.
Very nuanced, and really well said. There is a lot of opportunity to leverage blockchain decentralized finance as a weapon. Now, I want to hear Amanda's thoughts, and perhaps she may have something different to say from a security standpoint. Amanda Wick, a brilliant panelist that we've had the fortune to host on the TCAE platform before, is a senior investigative counsel at U.S. House of Representatives. That's all I'll say on the matter. And a former chief of legal affairs at Chainalysis, also led or was a senior policy advisor at FinCEN, and a federal prosecutor in the past for the Department of Justice. Now, Amanda, from an existential threat perspective, we know that the stolen funds from Tornado Cash benefited the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. What does this mean, and how is it affecting conversations on sanctions within the Treasury? And really, what are the looming existential security threats? If you could just reflect on the CFD portion of AML CFD, please.
Yeah, well, I think, to piggyback on some things that Dante said, this is a really important conversation. It goes back to a conversation that I think he and I have been having for maybe 2 years, which is the importance of responsible innovation, which isn't really talked about enough when you're talking about financial services. And so, a lot of times it gets lost. You pointed out the North Korean aspect, but the North Korean part was actually relatively small when you consider that a third of the funds that went through Tornado, at least that have been mapped, are known to have been illicit, right? So there's this perception that the really risky thing to national security is the CFT part, and I don't want to undersell the risk of the risk of terrorist financing, but there's some really terrible people in the anti-money laundering pool as well. And what we've seen over the last few years is kind of a blending of groups in terms of organizations that were very good at money laundering who have now spread out and are basically money laundering for everyone. So if you look online, there's a lot of reporting about certain Chinese organized crime groups that are now laundering a lot of money for Mexican drug cartels. So this idea that they're two separate buckets that we can say, well, terrorist financing is in this bucket and AML is in this bucket and never the twain shall meet, is just not reality. And so trying to say, well, there's this small portion of risk of North Korea funding, and this is the real part to worry about, ignores that a third of Tornado Cash was known illicit funds, emphasis on known, because some of it that wasn't mapped might make that number larger. And the idea that you're just going to create a software, launch it out there, even if it's a DAO, launder the funds for a sanctioned country, to Dante's point with nuclear capability, and then have no ramifications, or that a government isn't going to take any action, is is so unrealistic and just doesn't reflect our world after 9/11. So I say that to say that I think one of the things that this really shined a light on, because we were having these conversations 2 years ago with folks in industry who were like, well, we're DeFi, like we just put it out there. And I'm like, except that you're moving millions or billions of dollars in seconds for pennies on the dollar. And you have a responsibility in financial services in the transfer of funds to prevent these things. And colloquially, I used to tell people, look, as a former federal prosecutor, I'll just put it this way. Someday, if you're responsible for funding the next 9/11, you have a choice at what table you want to be sitting at in that courtroom in front of 12 people. I personally would choose to be at the federal prosecutor table, but if you're comfortable sitting at the other table justifying to 12 people, all we did was put that out there with no responsibility, and we can't be held responsible. If that's the table that you want to be sitting at, then by all means, ignore everything. There's blockchain companies that offer on-chain oracles for sanction screening. There's really no excuse for irresponsible innovation now. That's the problem that I think some of these companies are going to have. Yes, it's a new nuanced conversation, but that conversation, I think, should be happening a lot more now. I take no position, even though I'm a government employee, these views are my own and obviously don't represent anybody in the government. And I don't want to speak to like the breadth of OFAC sanctions, but conceptually in terms of the sanctions of a non-person, I think the industry needs to be ready for that as a concept, because the idea that you're somehow going to get around the CFT AML obligations by trying to disavow responsibility for launching something that moves billions of dollars, I think is one of the really important takeaways of the Tornado Cash designation.
That's a great insight. And you're right. It's irresponsible to even think that you could disavow yourself of AML CFT obligations. And in Dante's words, Amanda's always on the right side of history and thought. Just remember that, people. Now, this conversation on sanctions, like Amanda said, is not new. So exactly how old is this conversation? And let me turn to you, our audience. We have a poll, and we want to ask you, Suzanne, if you could launch the poll on sanctions. We want to ask you exactly, when was the first Bitcoin address sanctioned by OFAC? And also a quick reminder to Hash, if you're able to turn on your camera so that we can see your beautiful face.
Oh, hello.
Hi. Very good. So 39% of the audience is really on top of their OSINT skills. At least I believe half of you have leveraged your OSINT skills. And you're quite right. November 2018 is when 2 Iranian nationals and their Bitcoin addresses were sanctioned for conducting ransomware attacks. So you see, these problems are not only complex, but also ever growing in scale. And all the more reasons for us to continue having these conversations. Now, I want to talk about the topic, which is trends, emerging trends and trends that we expect. So I want to turn to the very person who thinks about trends and studies, industry all day, Clark. Clark Flynt-Barr is the senior policy advisor at Chainalysis. She was also an intelligence analyst at the Bureau and a program officer at American Bar Association. And before that, a legislative aide at Senate Judiciary Committee. Her specialty, or before she was with Chainalysis, she specialized in darknet market and cartel cases. So I would think, Clark, you are the authority figure on crypto crime trends and all the reports. I mean, what I call the Bible of crypto crime, which is Chainalysis reports. I'm sure you have made many contributions to that. So I want to ask you about some surprising trends we've seen this year. We saw a decline in the amount of funds sent to scam, while a large amount of funds had been stolen by hackers. Do you have any anticipation on emerging trends and whether you think the atmosphere may change in the coming months and 2023?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate being on this panel with all these other amazing panelists. This is such an important topic and something that, yes, I think about all day long, and really excited to be here with you all. And this trend issue is really exciting to me. As you said, scams, we've seen some interesting trends there. Scams are usually at the top category. They're usually the top category that Chainalysis sees in terms of the illicit use of cryptocurrency. That's been true for the past few years, but recently we've actually seen a decrease in scam revenue. So when we were looking at the numbers in July, when we did a mid-year crypto crime update, we saw that scam revenue was actually down by 65% from the same time in 2021. And I'll caveat this by saying our data is always getting better. We're always learning about new things and attributing them in our tools and adding that to our data. So those numbers that I share, they're the floor, not the ceiling. And it's possible that they'll increase, and we will see that there's been more scamming activity. But we think that the decrease in scam revenue is due to a couple of things. The first being that there's been a decrease in the price of cryptocurrencies over the past few months. So that's made scamming in crypto a less attractive option, right? This is one of the types of illicit activity that we see in crypto that is price sensitive. And not only have we seen the revenue drop, we've actually seen the number of transfers to scam related addresses drop. So not just the overall revenue received, but the amount of transfers, the amount of scamming activity has also dropped. And so this could be an indication of a couple of things. It could be an indication of growing public awareness about cryptocurrency scams. I know that I am seeing a lot more public service announcements. I know, for example, a number of US agencies and other international agencies have put out a lot of materials on cryptocurrency related scams and are doing a lot of work to educate the public on this. It could also be an indication of law enforcement improving their capacity to go after these scammers and more effectively cracking down on this activity. So it's certainly an interesting trend to track. And as someone has noted in the comments, scammers tend to go after where they're going to make the most money. So I think that is what we're seeing here. Some of the other trends that are worth noting include what we're seeing in darknet marketplaces, which, as you noted, that's how I got into crypto. That's what I worked when I was at the FBI. So this is particularly interesting to me. We've seen a decrease in darknet marketplace revenue, and this corresponds almost exactly with the April seizure of Hydra Market. And Hydra is a Russian language darknet marketplace. And it was the biggest darknet marketplace at the time of its seizure. And it was designated by OFAC. A number of its cryptocurrency addresses were also included on the SDN list as identifiers and coordinated. And there was a coordinated international law enforcement effort to take down the site as well. And what's interesting about the decrease in revenue in darknet marketplaces is that we have not seen a decrease in darknet transactions. In fact, we've actually seen an increase there. So I think what we're seeing is people trying to find the replacement marketplaces for Hydra Market. We're seeing vendors and buyers trying to figure out like what's going to be the new Hydra Market. What's the new venue for buying and selling illicit drugs on the darknet. And then as far as broader crime trends go, some criminals like scammers seem to be more susceptible to the price fluctuations, but there are other categories of crime like ransomware actors where they don't care what the price of Bitcoin is. And North Korean hackers also don't care. So it's important to take that into consideration as well. So I think that'll be an interesting thing to track over the next few months. Jinisha, I think we've lost or I've lost your audio.
Thank you. I can always count on you to remind me. Thank you. That was very insightful, Clark, and especially the bit on darknet markets. While we may not see juggernaut marketplaces like Hydra, we do see a lot of small shops which are unidentified, which indicates that they're so small that even it's difficult for blockchain monitoring tools to identify them and being used for illicit activity. Now, I know Dante has to drop earlier today, so I want to invite any comments you might have, Dante, on specific trends that you notice.
Yeah, no, happily, Jinisha, thank you. And of course, Clark and Amanda's comments are incredibly thoughtful as always, and just kind of keeping us up to date. So what is interesting about crypto and crypto risk is it borrows the blend of the things that you would see in traditional analog finance with the operating reality of cyber risk and cyber resilience, which is that you as the good actor have to be right 100% of the time, and the bad actor has to be right once to sow incalculable havoc. And so the just in the last 90 days, we have had, on the one hand, I think some incredibly positive trends. Just yesterday, for example, overnight, acknowledging the Ethereum merge, a powerful example that much of this technology and much of this infrastructure is continuously upgradable and open source. That has, I think, incredible improvements in otherwise vulnerable single source of failure financial markets infrastructure. For those of you listening from the United States, remember Equifax as a teachable lesson in what happens when a single honeypot is attacked and exploited. The totality of the US workforce, more than 150 million people, have a lifelong identity theft exposure. And so nothing in crypto, not a single crypto risk, has caused any damage societally as big or as complicated as that. I just want to say that now that, of course, that doesn't give crypto a pass, nor should we apologist, because you've had some very teachable lessons very recently. More than $2 billion of exploits of bridges that have been vulnerable. So we're defeating the purpose of crypto, which is the distribution and an anti-fragile system in which no single loss or no single breach of a wallet should be catastrophic to the system. We're starting to replicate some of the bad behaviors of traditional finance by creating bridges that themselves become honeypots. And so there's been a lot of exploits of bridges recently. And then there's just a lot of exploits candidly in the malicious code variety and in the inability to provide code audits at scale. And so the challenge, and we learned this lesson also in 2011 with the Knight Capital high-speed trading firm failed in the span of 45 seconds in 2011 because a rogue algorithm bought more positions than the company could afford, and it was a high-speed trading firm on Wall Street. And so rogue technology, I think equally, and the keyboard and the chair risks equally, always produce 50% of the risks that you would see with technology. And so I think we all too often take the assumption that just because it is crypto, it is safe and it is cyber resilient and it is tamper-proof. I think that's one of these critical flaws in the way we think about it. And the last point, I think a lot of people have continuously learned the hard way that one of the most important adages in this industry, not your keys, not your crypto, remains patently true. We learned that the hard way in Canada. Of course, this is an old case, the Quadriga CX debacle. But that, I think, continues to be an issue that plagues many, many providers. And last but not least, not to be outdone, the hardest question that we've learned right now in this liquidity crunch, what I'm calling crypto's troubled asset release program, where a lot of companies have revealed big vulnerabilities, lacks of revenue models and business models, is that what happens and what are the consumer protection standards in the bankruptcy or failure, irrespective of the cause, a cyber breach, a technology breach, a hack, a fraud case, OFAC sanctions could effectively put a lot of these companies and exchanges and others out of business. Is it really your asset, and how does it convey to you in the failure of the protocol, the company, the technology, the custodian? These questions are being asked, but we don't have answers yet. So on that cheerful bombshell, I will slowly exit stage left and thank you, colleagues and Jinisha and Suzanne and TCAE for having me today. Next time around, I'll hang out longer, I promise.
We'll hold you to it, sir.
Thank you. Cheers, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you for your time. Okay. While Dante was here, he said something meaningful. One of the things is we are seeing a replication of bad behavior from traditional finance. It's such an interesting thing. And you know who can speak more to it? Our next panelist, Malcolm Wright. He is the founder of Innofi Advisory from APAC and the head of strategy for Shift, the revolutionary DeFi platform that's trying to connect the dots between centralized and decentralized finance. He is also, or was previously, the executive at Revolut and BitMEX, and Director of Regulatory Affairs for APAC at GBBC Digital Finance, which is the Global Blockchain Business Council. And also leads a very interesting project with Waltzberg to facilitate easier onboarding between financial institutions and virtual asset service providers. And therefore, I want to ask you just about that, about the bridge between traditional finance and virtual asset service providers in relation to the travel rule, which is something we haven't quite solved yet as an industry, specifically the sunrise issue. Now, if we look at the traditional finance parallel, that would be SWIFT, which actually will be replaced very shortly by ISO 20022 standard. And I know you're at the forefront. In fact, you led this conversation and the development of IVMS 101, Intervast Messaging Standard, is that right? So if you could just speak to us about that and what is the hope for us solving the travel rule issue together, and really who's ultimately liable for what goes on?
Thank you, Jinisha. Thank you, everybody, as well for tuning in and for TCAE for having me today. Okay, yeah, the travel rule. There are many angles to this. And really a couple of them that I wanted to highlight is it is the missing gap for sanctions compliance in crypto. That's the first one, and I'll explain that in a second. The second part is very much around, it's not actually, the hard part of it is not actually about AML and CFT compliance. That's the easy part. The thing that every compliance officer right now should be focused on is data privacy and security. Because what we face, if it's done incorrectly, if it's implemented incorrectly, is something that actually Dante mentioned a moment ago. You know, we haven't had an Equifax incident. We could have an Equifax incident. So this is why it's very, very, very important for any compliance officer looking to implement travel rule to do it in a way where they are considering data privacy and data security of whatever solution they're choosing. Now, one of the problems with travel rule is that at the moment there's 6, 7 different providers of the rails that allow the two exchanges to speak to one another, and that the way in which that information is transferred, that will really vary from solution to solution. Some it will route through centralized servers, and some it will route through, it will be stored on a centralized server where there's no liability in terms of the data. But each of these solutions at the moment can't really talk to each other. And we're talking about interoperability, but the reality is interoperability between these solutions is very, very hard. What we are going to end up with, I think, is a world where we'll have multiple solutions, but we need some way of automatically recognizing who is the counterparty exchange, the counterparty VASP, that's sitting on the other end of a transaction in a way that you can automate it and you can do it reliably down to a jurisdictional level. So for example, if there's a global VASP, and let's say they operate in Europe, they operate in the US, they operate in Asia, and they have different entities, it's important to be saying, I'm sending my data to the correct entity in the correct jurisdiction, because otherwise I may fall foul of, you know, GDPR or some other legislation. So we really need to, it's very important for us to work out, first of all, how do we work out who the counterparty is to a transaction? And then how do we make sure we securely transfer that data? And that's kind of the work that we're focused on right now. There's also the underlying standards. So you mentioned there, Jinisha, about IVMS 101. We are about to reform that group. It was 2 years now since we produced that standard, and we're about to reassemble the Avengers who built it the first time around to do an updated version of that, but then also to look at future standards as well. So, for example, the ability to do refunds may become important. And being able to say, okay, I've received some funds that I didn't really want, how do I send them back? That kind of thing. So making sure that travel rule messages can start to facilitate that kind of output. The last part of this big puzzle is looking very much at regulation. So at the moment, there's this asymmetry about regulation. So in the US, obviously, there has been, the BSA has actually had travel rule covered for a good number of years now, but it's not yet enforced in full. If we go to Korea on the other end of the scale, last year it was a hard deadline. If you don't comply, exchanges in Korea, you lose your bank accounts. And that was then followed by, if you don't comply, then there's actually sanctions and other things that can apply up until you lose your license to operate. So we have those two extremes. And somewhere in the middle, there's other regulations or other countries that are in different stages of implementation, but it's still not enough. So at the moment, there's well, we don't have to really put travel rule in yet because we don't need to comply, but it may be that the counterparty does. And this is the sunrise issue, where you have VASPs in one jurisdiction, let's say Korea, where they have to comply right now, and others in a jurisdiction where they don't. And how do you start to map out solving that problem? And tied into that whole, how do we discover who the counterparty VASP is to a transaction in an automated way? Tied into that is a solution to how do we sort of compress that sunrise period between where everybody has to then comply and be able to respond. Now, I mentioned very quickly at the top, sanctions. So a lot of sanctions legislation around the world is built around the point around being able to say you are not transacting with a known sanctioned counterparty. Now, at the moment, a lot of exchanges are simply saying, okay, well, I use chain analysis, which is good, by the way. I use chain analysis to look at a sanctioned address, which is, okay, that gets you part of the way, as long as, for example, it is on an OFAC sanctions list. But let's say a sanctioned entity in another jurisdiction is using a brand new address. And now you don't know whether they're sanctioned or not. So travel rule is the missing link because it allows you, and the purpose of it is to say, I'm gathering details of who is on both ends of the transaction, and I'm going to screen it with well-check, LexisNexis or whatever, for sanctions. And therefore I can then make an informed decision as to whether I accept it, freeze the funds, whatever I then may do. So that travel rule piece is actually broader than just the AML-CFT part. It really does go very heavily into the sanctions part as a risk mitigation, and then into data security and data privacy to make sure that when you are implementing, you are doing it in a way that protects your users' data without compromise. And you apply the same standards as you would internally to say, I want to make sure nobody's got access to that data except for the person that the entity or counterparty VASP at the other end that needs it.
Thank you. Can I ask you, Malcolm, so how are things looking for Korea?
Internally or?
In terms of the travel rule regulations?
So the travel, yeah, I mean, it's in place, and currently you have 2 travel rule solution providers operating inside Korea, and within those solutions, internally inside Korea, I think you can do third-party transfers. When it comes to external transfers going abroad, the guidance from the regulator and the FIU is actually you can only do first-person transfers. So that means same name account internally and externally. Now, obviously that becomes very restrictive. So the idea is, well, the ideal that we want to get to is and elsewhere in the world is actually you do first and third person transfers, but in a secure way. The way that the Korean regulators are looking at this in the moment is very much, at the moment, because of the Sunrise issue, because overseas VASPs don't really have to comply, you can't therefore judge them at the same bar, the same standard, and therefore the risk is higher. And this is why only first-person transfers that are confirmed as first-person transfers are being permitted.
Quite a development, but there are still some challenges, which reminds me, this is not just a regulatory issue, it's a technological issue, it's an infrastructure issue, and really a great discussion for different regions in the world to partake in. For example, MENA, UAE being the aspiring, or really the crypto hub for MENA. So I want to invite Dr. Bhaskar Dasgupta, who is at the forefront of crypto adoption in MENA. He is currently the advisory board member and head of strategic development at Apex Group. Previously, he led developed the International Financial Center, which is the award-winning center in Abu Dhabi with ADGM. Dr. Dasgupta is an angel investor to many health tech and biotech and ed tech and fintech companies, and was also the chief operating officer at UK Export Finance. And of course has done quite remarkable work in investment banking and tech consulting with several multinational corporations rather. So Dr. Dasgupta, you are really at the forefront of this movement, developing crypto adoption for UAE specifically. And I know there's a lot of excitement in the region. Just last week, Saudi Arabia appointed a crypto chief at the Central Bank of Saudi Arabia. So there is speculation that this may be an attempt to catch up with all the wonderful stuff you're doing in the UAE. I want to ask you, what can you take, or what tips will you choose to take from the existing conversations in the sphere, and what are the very specific MENA specific challenges for regulators and investors in MENA?
First of all, thank you very much for inviting, and fascinating and absolutely wonderful set of panelists and attendees. So I'm learning so much. So let me try and answer your question. Within Abu Dhabi, we've been working on virtual assets now since 2017. So perhaps one of the earliest regulators who got into this area. And we consciously decided that we need to take a new look at how rules and regulations are placed around here. Traditionally, what happens is that whenever new technology or new products come in, you first reach out to the AML bat. So let's try and address it from that perspective. So some of the basic things that we decided was we're going to look at virtual assets from the perspective of it being a security. Second thing is, we're not going to talk about utility tokens. So if you've got some token with a dog on it, or you're planning to do something with watermelons, not interested. Thank you. I know that does have an issue that it's not going to be covered by us, but that's fine. We had to draw the line somewhere. The second thing that the regulatory framework did was, as I mentioned, consciously avoid just looking at the AML CFT piece only. So it's actually a multi-dimensional perspective that we put in. So AML CFT is there. Second is customer protection. Third is technology governance. Fourth is how do you actually run the exchanges and brokers. And the last is how do you handle custody. So when you are looking at these things, so the rule book is extremely rich. And to put it in another way, we actually would go through applicants over months for them to explain how they will fit into our regulations. And it can literally take years for them to get approved. What that does mean is that once these firms are approved by Abu Dhabi Global Market, you know that they are rock solid, absolutely rock solid. I mean, I would normally get anything between 3 to 5 inquiries on setting up a virtual asset firm every day. And the vast majority will basically not pass muster. So once you have these multi-layered mechanisms for virtual assets, you realize that if you look upon, for example, the conversations that we are happening, these are happening on the far end. These are post-consumer issues that we are tracking. Issue has already happened. We were trying to think about what we can do to avoid the problem happening right at the very beginning. So whether you're talking about consumer protection, whether you're talking about how are you handling custody, if you are starting to look at what is your market monitoring mechanisms, the regulator actually put in real-time monitoring of the transactions, including forks and all. So pretty much space age way. When you start talking about how do you look after these new products, not just the firms, but the regulators also have to think about different way of working. This is no longer the old way of working and historical review and checks. You've got to be on the front foot. You know, Malcolm was talking about on the travel route. So right now we are actively discussing with the regulator as to how those things can be connected. And what you have to remember is that the UAE specifically is not just a domestic jurisdiction. It is an international jurisdiction, and loads of firms are over here. So, for example, I believe there are about 40 odd firms already authorized in Abu Dhabi, and there are somewhere around about 300 firms in the pipeline in Dubai. So given the fact that it's tax efficient, it's English common law, it's got the world's first and perhaps only digital court, all these aspects mean that we cannot rely on things to be fixed once they have happened. Yes, that normally is there, but we need to start fixing and changing the mechanism right at the very beginning. And you have to think about it in different ways. Not only that, now we are starting to talk about moving it much further by thinking about how can virtual assets be an accepted asset class for professional clients as well as for institutional clients. So if we are talking about somebody who's an investor in a fund, and that particular fund, so for example, 40% of hedge funds are now investing in crypto assets, how are you going to get a consolidated NAV? How are you going to execute it properly? So these are some of the aspects that we are currently grappling with. We are also starting to come up with a standardized, if you will, terminology. We are starting to think about how can we get approval for virtual assets on a fast and efficient way. They have to be regulated. You can't just issue anything and off with it. They can do it, but it's not going to be regulated. But how can we improve? So these are some of the very, very interesting pieces that we're looking. On the other hand, we're also starting to look at very interesting business models, like purely crypto banks. We are starting to look at purely funds that are actually tokenized, therefore distributing it on a primary, secondary, and tertiary basis. DTCC is starting to talk about using blockchain. So I would say that these and the other things that are coming up, like NFTs, which we haven't talked about, is actually changing the entire micro as well as macro structure of the entire financial sector.
Thank you. Thank you. That was a great insight into what's taking place in the region. And you're right, the rule book is rather extensive. I read a paper which was published by ADGM, the FSRA, back in 2020, which specified that the FSRA, we will not tolerate fraud or AML-CFD risks from anonymity, meaning everybody needs to be identified through due diligence and KYC. Now, this speaks extensively of the issue at hand with travel rule and different counterparties not being on board. And so I just want to remind everybody, we do have a panel that will talk about all things about travel rule implementation, FATF, and all about MICA, which is going to start at 10:45. And Abdullah will be moderating the panel. But I wonder, Malcolm, if you had any comments on what Dr. Dasgupta just said?
If Malcolm doesn't, I definitely do.
Oh, I'll leave it to Amanda. I'll let Amanda that one.
Well, I just wanted to, the topic here is trends and challenges in crypto compliance. And, something that came out, and Dr. Bhaskar, please feel free to disagree with me, but it was something that we were talking about yesterday at a GBBC event, which is, the nature of globalization of all of this is that I think you're going to see some countries that have the ability to be nimble and fast. Everybody has a tendency to think, oh, we're going to wait and see what the US does. But what we've never done really well is move quickly or nimbly. And that's a real problem when you're talking about an area that requires quick and nimble analysis. And I think what you're going to see is an egalitarian, almost kind of everyone talks about the democratization. I think what you're going to see is a democratization where businesses want regulatory clarity. Right now in the US, we have 2 bills under consideration after a decade of virtual assets. But you have countries like Dr. Bhaskar talked about, like Singapore, like the UK, that are putting these plans into place. You have countries that are giving this regulatory clarity, and businesses and industry will flock to regulatory clarity. And so there is this very real question about past hegemony and what that relied on and whether it survives in the future if you have jurisdictions that are nimbly and quickly looking at the principles and saying, we understand the technology. What does this look like if what we know to be true, forget what we used for cash, but if we just want to ensure, sanctions, meeting FATF guidelines, if we just strip it down to the foundational pillars and then creatively and nimbly build a regulatory framework for that, you could see in the future kind of like the past titans of financial services. Everybody thinks the risk to the dollar is the CBDC discussion, but the sleeper, I think, is actually the lack of regulatory clarity in this industry. And the US's kind of like risk here is not moving fast enough in comparison to jurisdictions that are really moving on this and are attracting business because people want that clarity. So I think it's a really important trend to look at, are these jurisdictions that are leaning into this and are doing it quickly and correctly and are giving these businesses the clarity that they need. It's just something I'd throw out there for consideration.
Amanda, if I may, can I just also be slightly controversial?
Jinisha knows I love spicy, so go for it.
Yes, it's about time.
I'm on the board of regulated firms. You know what worries me is not so much as the regulations, but the lack of properly qualified compliance people. That is one of my biggest risks. We simply don't have good quality, active. Look, I mean, the regulators can't be expected to know about everything. And I do understand your point that people are moving at different speeds, which is what historically the thing has been done. But if you're based in a common law jurisdiction, then you can borrow from other common law jurisdictions. So I'm relatively comfortable. My biggest problem is you don't have compliance people who can actually make that leap of faith. Not everything is explained on a rule book. It is so bloody difficult to find good people, and it's unbelievable. And we are actually at this moment don't have good solutions to fix that problem at all. Don't have a solution, but it is a big problem.
I can't agree with that more. I'm sure, Hash, you look like you want to jump in, but I would definitely say, even from my time at Chainalysis, when I was in the government, a knowledge of crypto tracing, how to do this, education has been our biggest challenge. We cannot build compliance investigators. We can't build crypto investigators fast enough. That is a massive problem that we don't talk about enough, 100%. But Hash, it looked like you were, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Fine. No, that's fine.
This is actually a good time to introduce Hash, our last panelist. And then Clark, will go to you. I think you also have some insights. Hash Qureshi is the partner, well, a partner at MNP, has done some very meaningful work in engineering, in AI engineering. And really, I can't name a single function that he has not led within MNP and elsewhere. So he conducts regular AI and deep learning engagements with the government of Canada. He also spent 7 years at Cognos, the software company, and another 7 years at Ernst & Young. And before that, this is very interesting and the type of colorful background that I was referring to earlier. He was at the Royal Canadian Armed Force for 10 years as a captain. And now, as a partner at MNP, you regularly consult to audit, well, you consult to exchanges in DeFi and traditional finance, and you conduct audits. And of course, there are many audit considerations and compliance program training that service providers need to go through. So if you could maybe offer some audit considerations that compliance teams could make in this environment before registering their exchanges in Canada.
Yes, certainly we'll be happy to. And again, thank you for the opportunity to be with such a great group of people, incredible panelists. I actually want to tie back to things Amanda and Dante have said, and I'm definitely a super geek, and any super geek is going to be a fan of Stan Lee's and Spider-Man, and you know where I'm going. So Dante talked about superpowers of crypto and the speed, and Amanda talked about responsible innovation. So put those together, superpowers, responsible innovation. I think it is touching the very core of what has to happen on the corporate control side. The controls, and I'm going to use a metaphor. Imagine a horse and buggy control system being put on a Formula One car. It's just not going to work. And this space, and I'm going to call it digital cash or virtual assets. This space moves. The speed is something that needs to be addressed. The transaction speed, the speed with which mistakes can happen, and I think one of the things we've got to do is establish credibility, and the way to do that is having the right control environment within the organizations. Now, I'm just going to get down to maybe uber practical, down to earth. If you're a company and you need to think about using an exchange, I'll give you two pieces of advice based on lessons very recently learned. Our firm denied an opinion and in fact suggested, well, you have two choices: a qualified opinion or denial of opinion, and we're going towards denial of opinion for our client. And what the issue was is that the client was using an exchange that had only recently obtained a SOC 2 report, and for 2 years they didn't have anything. And this was really problematic for the company because they were facing a very large, lucrative transaction, and the regulator and the acquirer really wanted to have 2 years of audited financials. So this became a very big problem for them. So what I would say is, if you're going to work with exchanges, make sure they have a SOC 2 report, and make sure that the nature of the SOC 2 report is ones that your customer, your clients are going to care about. And yes, thank you. Somebody mentioned what a SOC. It's really a report about where an auditor goes in and looks at the control environment of something being outsourced. Okay. The second thing is a lot of our clients think that the old way of reconciling and think gerbil and wheels, trying to manually keep track of transactions that are happening. That's going to be very, very difficult to do if you're becoming successful. If you're doing a lot of transactions, human beings are not going to be able to daily reconcile what's happening. So that leads to you working with Exchange APIs and your ability to track what happens in the exchange, what the errors are. You can't blame the exchange if you haven't thought through what you're going to do with error conditions. And we like wrapping all this together in something called general digital cache controls. And I think those general digital cache controls speaks to the type of things Dr. Bhaskar, Amanda, Clark, Dante, they've looked at it from the outside in. And I think companies have to look at from the inside out and say, how are we going to keep up? And especially if you put fiat next to digital cash and need to be able to report on both, how do you do that with confidence? And Dr. Bhaskar talked about compliance and skills lacking. I'd even say, about 10, 15 years ago, people really were talking about audit committees having the right skills and experience to call out management to make sure that the control environment is there. Well, that goes doubly for this space, for digital cash. The audit committee has to be informed. The audit committee and the board need to understand what they're dealing with if they're sitting on a company that is dealing with digital cash and fiat. I know kind of maybe boring for some people, but this is the world I live in.
Thank you. Super nerds are never boring. Malcolm, I wonder if you wanted to piggyback on the audit-related comments and also maybe reflect on the work that Wolfsburg is doing in creating synergies between traditional finance and DeFi. I know there is a questionnaire that may be like the traditional correspondent banking Wolfsburg questionnaire. Now there might be a crypto version of that. Is that right? If you could speak to that.
Yeah, sure. So a couple of years, it's actually a project that's driven from Global Digital Finance, or GBBC Digital Finance as it is now. That's gdf.io if anyone wants to look at the website. So that's a membership organization for crypto firms. We've had an AML working group that's been running now for close on 4 years. Looking at, and we've worked very, very closely with all of the FATF consultations and virtual asset contact group and so forth. A couple of years ago, in leading the group, I thought I could see that there was a problem with regards to how VASPs would onboard other VASPs actually to solve the travel rule. Because one of the requirements of FATF guidelines is that a VASP should know its counterparty VASP, to make sure it's in a jurisdiction where, there's no, it's not sanctioned, it's not high risk or whatever it might be, but also looking at it from a AML perspective. So what happens if your counterparty VASP happens to have no controls whatsoever for AML? So at that point, we started to say, okay, it's time to put together a questionnaire. What can we draw on? Over here, we've got the Wolfsburg questionnaire for correspondent banking. This looks quite good. And I believe actually next week, there's going to be a session on that will talk a little bit more about it. But so we took the Wolfsburg questionnaire with their permission, and I sort of kept in constant contact with them, and said, okay, let's take what looks, feels, and smells like a Wolfsburg questionnaire for correspondent banking. Because when I was chief compliance officer at BitMEX and before that Equinix, I get sent the correspondent banking questionnaire, and it's like, okay, I'm a crypto firm, not applicable, not applicable, not applicable to all these questions. So we said, okay, we'll take this and we'll turn it into a crypto version, but we'll make sure it looks and feels the same as the original questionnaire. And the moment we did that, then it was like, actually, this is now really interesting, because now we've got something that's not only suitable for a very good quality VASP to VASP onboarding, particularly if you're going to use them for more than just travel rule, but also it acts as a very good VASP to FI onboarding. So what happens if a VASP wants a bank account? This now gives a standardized way of collecting that information, exactly the same information that would be for correspondent banking, in a sense that it's, what are your high risk, are you touching privacy coins? or what's your AML policy, and do you have a sanctions screening tool? When did you last calibrate it? Those kinds of things. And it's not a questionnaire that's like, okay, it's there, but it's like an examination that you're getting, you pass or fail. It's really an assessment that a bank can then use. Now, the beauty is, you as a crypto firm, you complete it once, and then you can distribute it multiple times if you're going for multiple bank accounts. We presented it into some of the tier 1 banks as well. It's been very, very well received because it's really helping to build that consensus. We're hoping to sign it off really in about the next 1 month to 6 weeks, and then release it on the world. So at that point, we hope, we're pushing for the banks to take a look and to start to adopt it, because we see the value. And we see the value for crypto firms to be able to get banking if the risk and compliance teams in banking can actually understand how to assess the risk. So the starting point is ask the right questions. If you ask the right questions, you get the right answers. So when you start to get the answers, then you can make a really informed decision. So as I said, it's coming soon. We're already using an earlier version of it in some of the VAST onboarding in some of the solutions that are out there for travel rule, but it should be a defining point the same way that the correspondent banking questionnaire was for WillSpay.
Beautiful. So we've talked today about trends, regulations, how to keep up with them. And I just want to point the conversation back, if I may, to the broader trends. And in light of all of these technical and regulatory issues, what can we, the private sector, what can individuals who are at least trained enough to detect some crime, what can we do, specifically using tools that we have? Now, I know sanctions are very new, especially smart contract sanctions. And I know tools like Chainalysis have done a great deal to adapt to the regulatory environment, and they've given us the tools to better detect SDN lists. So I want to go to Clark, who's been quiet for a while, and I want your feedback, if I may, on specifically on sanctions, but just to give some context here. Recent Chainalysis report highlighted the growth of low-cost Bitcoin mining in Iran. And this is topical, as Iran recently announced that they will be using cryptocurrency to pay for imports, along with Russia, who also announced they will be using or looking to use cryptocurrency for cross-border payments. So Iran's estimated mining revenue in the last 6 years is 186 million. Now, this is very easy. It's low-cost energy in Iran. So what do we need to think about in terms of sanctions violation risks, especially with crypto adoption in these non-compliant countries? And how can we as individuals and agencies better monitor exposure to Iranian and Russian counterparties? Clark.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I've been really enjoying the conversation today. I think when it comes to monitoring for sanctions risks and ensuring that Iranian and Russian sanctioned individuals and actors are not exploiting your platforms, there's a number of things, of course. Through the normal KYC process, you're going to weed out folks that way, doing things like IP screening, of course. And then, as Malcolm mentioned earlier, you can use blockchain analysis tools to ensure that sanctioned individuals are not using your platform, that the addresses that have been included on OFAC's SDN list as identifiers. With yesterday's designation, there was a designation of a number of Iranian ransomware actors. There were 6 new addresses included in that designation. I think we're at about 400 addresses on the SDN list now. So you can use blockchain analysis tools to screen for exposure to that. We have pre-sanction screening tools, as someone mentioned earlier, and then we also have a transaction monitoring tool. And these enable you to take, to apply your own risk-based approach and tailor your alerts and see what the exposure is to addresses that are on the SDN list. I would also just, piggybacking on some of the earlier comments about regulators and keeping up with this technology and providing regulatory guardrails. I also agree that's super important. We want to be keeping the industry within regulatory guardrails, but within guardrails that are recognizing the uniqueness of this technology. And so I think that is a place where policymakers are struggling and where the industry can help. It's really hard to keep up with the technology and understand how things are moving. And so I think that's where TCAE and capacity building programs like this are really important, and ensuring that there's lots of training for policymakers, for compliance officers, as Dr. Bhaskar mentioned earlier, so that we are building compliance in this space, and also the knowledge that regulations are appropriate and adequate.
Can I just interject for a little while, please?
Yes, please.
One of the things that I would say is that we need to guard against a tendency for compliance and risk, and we think about virtual assets. Oh, let me come up with a new solution for that particular asset class or business. What my thinking is, and this is just my opinion, please don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. We have set up a compliance stack, starting from technology, people, process, governance, data, security, education, all that nice stuff. When you put in these new compliance pieces together, it has to be integrated. Otherwise, we are right now running a substantial, what I would call as a risk, that bad actors can snoop through the things that we are not covering. So it has to be an integrated whole. And at the end of the day, so whenever I used to evaluate new business proposals, I used to say, stop, please don't talk about technology. Talk to me about what is your business model? What is the business problem you're trying to solve? What product are you selling and how is it going to benefit? Because people fall in love with the technology and then they forget about the rest of the stuff. So over the last 20, 30, 40 years, we have built up a huge amount of knowledge and safety and anti-money laundering and anti-terrorism and those things. It has to be an integrated way. Otherwise, we will leave large holes.
Could I add something just to what Dr. Bhaskar was speaking to? Dr. Bhaskar, as you were outlining your stack, one of the things that's key is that technology is actually on the bottom. It's a foundational element. And I fully agree that it has to be integrated. And frankly, in a life long ago, I used to do attack and penetration and how to compromise the business, not the system, how to get at that. And the way to do it is to look for the seams, the things between the layers, and attack them. And usually the higher layers are easier to attack than the lower layers. But I fully agree with you that a fully integrated and thought through solutions are going to make sense. But if the technology is changing, I think you have to be ready to adapt because of those foundational elements.
Very well said indeed. Amanda, you're on mute, but I can hear you think. Do you have any input?
No, I don't know why my thinking was loud. Apologies for that. I don't know that I agree with so many of the really good points made with the incredible speakers on this panel. I think one of the problems, going back to something that Dr. Bhaskar mentioned, that I think all of us agree with, is the training and education aspect. But I will say, to one of the points that Hash made earlier, which is something along the lines of, I'm sorry, I'm going to geek out right now. There is a real problem because the technology is important and it matters. And I jokingly always say, like, I'm a Luddite in these waters compared to most folks. And I went to law school because I didn't want to do STEM or technology, right? And then here I am having to learn at least enough of it, for crypto. But it's actually a very real problem. And folks like those on the call, like, are unicorns in a way. And I don't put myself in this group because the tech part is probably the part that I constantly struggle and learn every day and find myself Googling terms. And I'm like, what does this even mean? But we have like a real issue because frankly, cash was pretty easy, right? Like a lot about, traditional finance was pretty straightforward. But, I have a real tough time convincing lawyers, at least in the United States, but lawyers around the world, that they need to start learning about technology, because a lot of us were really happy to not have to do that. And to Hash's point, it is a foundational principle of all this, like how the technology works matters. Even in the discussion of Tornado Cash, you saw people kind of like using all of these analogies and comparing it to other mixers, but it was unique and it was different, and how it moved funds and what it did with funds was very critically important in understanding the difference and the distinctions. So going back to kind of like one of the takeaways in terms of trends, we all really need to find a good way to get up to speed enough in this technology, whatever the sector that we're in, because there's just too many people who don't. And I think it's partially because some people think it's a fad and they don't want to invest in kind of like the time and energy that it takes to learn this, and they're just praying that it goes away. But to Dr. Bhaskar's point and to Hash's point, to the points that everybody has made, we are not going to survive if we don't have capable, qualified people who understand this technology, whether it be at exchanges, doing compliance, whether it's investigators, it's people at regulatory agencies and government agencies. There's not enough. We need to build them faster, and we need to really acknowledge that this is not hard. If I can learn it, anybody can learn it, but it does take time and it does take diligence. And to Carolina's point, 100%, you just have to not be afraid of innovation, and you just have to dive in and start Googling. There's so much training available, TCAE, Chainalysis, exchanges, like everybody has information out there. So there's really no reason not to do it other than fear, time limitations. I get it, but this isn't going anywhere. And people really need to start at least leaning into understanding this technology.
Indeed. It's one of the beauties of this industry. It's ever evolving and dynamic, and we're all learning at the same time, which brings up the next question posed by an audience member very early on. So we're all learning at the same time, including government agencies. Now, do you think, and this, anyone feel free to answer this, do you think governments around the world are doing enough to combat crypto financial crimes? Dr. Das.
Shaking his head.
Answer is no. Look, I've been a government servant and a senior civil servant in the British government. I worked in the regulator over here. I deal with regulators at government agencies around the world. No, answer is no. The reason answer is no is very simple, because governments and the civil service mechanism is not oriented towards meeting goals. It's oriented towards managing and following processes. And those processes are old. They do not react as good. Look, I understand you have to think about a ton of things when you're coming up with policy, government public policy. And there's a valley of death. You come up with an exquisitely crafted policy paper, then it goes through the internal departmental and then the legislative and then the implementation process. And by this time, there are about 4 to 5 years. Guess what? The crypto industry has gone up and done something fascinating till then. And then you come back and say, I'm going to fine you for something you did 6 years back. They're going to say, Seriously? So no, I'm afraid no, it is not there, and this is an issue.
Seems like it's one thing we all agree on. Go on, Amanda, Malcolm.
Oh, no, I definitely saw other head shakes. Somebody jump in. I'm definitely happy to let somebody else talk here. As Michael aptly noted, that was said so many faces at one time having the same reaction.
I'll jump in. I think that there's a real range, right? Like some countries have put a lot of effort into this. Like FinCEN has been regulating crypto from an AML perspective since 2013. And there are other places where there's nothing. And what we see is with illicit actors is that they recognize this and they take advantage of this. Like in particular with ransomware actors, they've figured out how to exploit the jurisdictional arbitrage opportunities there. And they cash out in places that aren't going to require KYC, that are not going to ask any questions. And it's a problem for law enforcement who are trying to track down the real identities of these bad actors and seize funds and make victims whole again. And I think it's a problem.
Yeah, the one thing I'll add to that is, as Clark noted, just taking FinCEN as an example, I can't speak for other countries because obviously my familiarity is largely with the United States, and Dr. Bhaskar, Hash, Malcolm, I would love your thoughts on this. But one of the things that we see is a huge dearth in appropriations to actually fund the ability to do these things, right? So you have this like executive order in the United States that comes out and tells all these agencies to write these reports, but doesn't actually appropriate additional resources. People are just supposed to do this on top of their day jobs. FinCEN is responsible for regulating thousands of money services businesses, virtual currency businesses, and 5 people are in that unit. And they're going to have the Enablers Act, and then they're also going to be responsible for lawyers, et cetera. So you're looking at the slow and persistent crushing of people in USG. Like Clark, used to work for the FBI. A number of people have left there. They do a relatively good job, but you still have funding issues at a lot of the agencies and regulators, especially the regulators. The 2 bills that we have pending that want to make the CFTC like on top of the regulator for this space, and the CFTC is not a giant agency historically. So when these bills come out, if they don't have sufficient appropriations and sufficient resources, you're literally throwing a solution that's useless, right? And you're just going to crush government employees. And as somebody guilty of this, they leave and go to the private sector where ironically, like there's only so much government service that you can do before it becomes kind of government torture. So I say this and I'm curious if this is a problem in other countries, but we just see this well, you just need to figure it out. You just need to do more with less. And it's but there's only 24 hours in a day. And these people are under-resourced, understaffed, overworked. And to Dr. Bhaskar point, there's not enough of them. They're very difficult to replace. So that's a problem that we see. I'm curious if others have seen that in other countries.
There is the only solution I can think about is for more parts of the relevant stakeholders to work very closely together. Traditionally, when you are Amanda and Clark and others have seen, regulators go, you know what, go sit there. If I want your opinion, I will give it to you. A substantial number of people operate on that. It cannot be done. We have to come together. And that's why, Jinisha, you were talking about why some of the regulators are, and Amanda and Clark as well, that some people are more responsive. This is where I think it is quite unique that the regulator, the participants, the universities are working fairly closely together. Nobody has all the answers. We have to work together. And that's the only way to survive. I think the way of collaboration needs to substantially increase. BIS is doing good work, right? But then when is the BIS working with, let's say, the blockchain or the cryptocurrency associations? They don't. Are they talking to the academic institutions about this major problem about compliance people? No. Are they talking about how NFTs can actually replace entire compliance records? No. So I think that kind of a discussion needs to happen much more. And if I may just again be slightly more controversial,
Please.
if the government, regulatory and enforcement agencies don't get their act together, the metaverse will supersede them.
Yeah.
Can I add something just again, just on that last point, and to answer a question from Amanda? Again, I'm actually literally based in Ottawa, right? Ottawa, and Ottawa is like, you know, for those around the world that might not know little old Canada, that's the capital and the seat of government. And I think the fact that regulators, and I'm not going to name any regulator, but if you're on the call, you know who you are. Your answer has been, we don't understand this area. So you know what? We'll have the audit firms not audit these companies, and maybe the industry will die because they can't find an auditor. At least in Canada, the number of firms that will audit companies that deal in digital cash and blockchain are like 3 across the country. And so I think the answer is never going to be, oh, because we don't know it, let's just make it really hard. Companies find a way, people find a way. That is not the answer. So I think getting educated and competent people in the regulators is a fantastic start to actually improving the entire ecosystem.
And
And
I will
it's going to
say,
happen.
and
Yeah, go
things
ahead,
like
Adam.
this, huge thank you to groups like TCAE that, to Dr. Bhaskar's point, bring everybody. I mean, if you look at even the diversity on this panel, bringing everyone together to have these conversations, they can't do it alone, and getting everybody in the room and things like this are so invaluable. So I know everybody did their thanks at the beginning, and I'll just say thank you for just an amazing group of fantastic questions and kind of getting to talk with everyone about it, because 100% +1 to Dr. Bhaskar's. None of us could do it alone, and it's these group conversations, I think, that are so critical.
Thank you. It seems that the conversation has just begun. Unfortunately, time is fleeting. Our time is up, and it seems that the audience has a lot of questions, which will be covered by the end of the day. I just want to take a minute to thank our esteemed panel for what has been an authentic, controversial, and a lively discussion. Thank you for joining us from your individual parts of the world. I know Malcolm has many plans to party today, and so do we, unfortunately, after the event. But thank you very much. If I may take 30 seconds of your time, and please, we only have like a couple seconds per panelist. So I have one last question, lightning round. What keeps you up? If there is a particular crypto crime trend or regulatory gap or training gap, in 1 to 5 words, what keeps you up? Malcolm, if you want to go first. Keeps you up at night, rather.
Lack of attention to data privacy and security.
Amanda?
Oh, I was so hoping to go last. I would say a lack of impetus to do, like so much talking and just not seeing a lot of change or movement.
Dr. Dasgupta.
I would go for lack of people. That is what worries me. All the problems can be solved by the suitable application of good people. We don't have them, not enough, and not in the quantities that we need.
Thank you. Clark, 5 words.
Policy that isn't based on data.
Oh, that's 6, so close.
I don't do math publicly.
And Hash.
And I would say the control environment and the people that understand this space good enough to implement good controls, for sure that.
Wow, all very good answers. And I'll take an opportunity to also answer it. What keeps me up at night are the human rights violations that persist even in this space. Thank you very much for your time. Please remember that while time is fleeting, the ideas shared here are not. and let's make a difference in this industry. Thank you for your time and your dedication, and judges, panelists. I'm so grateful that you could make time for us. I can't wait to see you again.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Have a good
everyone.
day.
Bye-bye.